Dr. Ria Roymaman from Leiden University. What is the surety that no one's going to derope you or strangle you to death while you're on the road? Nevertheless, what is the surety that you are secure and safe in your own house, that they're not going to drag you out of the house and stab you? Well, apart from the prayers that you have, there's a system that you probably be trusting in, right? That there is a law in place that is bringing about a social order, that is bringing about a change in our practice, giving us a level of security. Leaving aside the concept of corruption and other delays that could potentially come again, there is a factor that you rely upon in name of criminal law or be it a civil law. Similarly is the case with climate law. Tomorrow, when your house is lost in a landslide, or where it has been destroyed in a flood, or where your neighbor has burned plastic causing you discomfort or some kind of congestion, whom are you going to hold liable? Or what is a law that is going to give you a protection in this regard? And that is where the climate law come into action. So what is climate law? Climate law is the national and international legal principles which are enacted to regulate human behavior so as to control the consequences that it has on the climate, whereby there's a remedy available to the victims who are suffering some loss from the action thus created. Therefore, the idea of climate law is to mitigate and adapt to the changes that has been caused from a human action. There brings about an accountability and responsibility to our action, just like how we have in criminal or civil law. The reason is that every action of ours has a consequence that is going to be impacting the human or the biodiversity at large. In order to hold the person liable for their action and to reduce the consequence is why we have climate law in place. It is therefore important to remember that climate law is not about environment law. Even if you say it's part of environment law, that's fine. But climate law is inherently interdisciplinary and integrated to other disciplines of law. It has something to do with energy law, corporate law, criminal law, civil law, tort law, you name it. Climate law has a shadow reflected upon all these actions regulating how mankind reacts to in a particular situation and how they behave and control their certain behavior that can have inherent damage to the community and then to the environment. So more than it regulating the harm of mankind on environment, we are trying to regulate the impact this action can have against another man. So now that we've discussed what climate law is, it's important to understand some of the key components that makes up climate law. There are finally 5 components that we need to remember. The first one is the mitigation element. So law takes in form of regulations and policies for the purpose of mitigating the action. This is a more futuristic perspective to regulate what could potentially contribute to the change of climate. This is in regard to regulation of the greenhouse gases, setting out carbon pricing, and that regulates human action that potentially contributes to this. This can be sourced from regulations like the Paris Agreement, which sets out a set of parameters that needs to be followed to regulate how we translate our work in a way that does not impact climate change. For example, we had set out a parameter of not to have climate increase more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now we have definitely crossed that limit, but Paris Agreement puts out a blanket in terms of what are the regulated activities in this regard. This is similarly found in case of carbon taxing, European law trade agreements, and likewise where they're trying to regulate future activities from contributing to the existing circumstance. Second component is the adaptation laws. We all know that climate change is no more a distant problem or a future problem. We are all victims and perpetrators to the challenge that we face. So it is important that the society and community is able to adapt to these challenges and is prepared to face as it comes. So flood, drought, landslides are not something that's new to us. But what is important here is to see how are we prepared to handle when situation like this arises. That is why we have the adaptation laws such as the disaster management laws, the compliance regulations, or water and land use planning mechanisms that act as a way that can support us to adapt to the circumstance. The third element that we have here is a corporate and financial climate governance. These are laws that are regulating corporate and financial institutions when it comes to climate governance, and it has become a very important and prominent part of corporate governance. ESG, fossil fuel disinvestment, the financial institutions' responsibility looking at the environmental sustainability practices while choosing investments have all become core element of practice to make sure that there's a level of regulation set out on corporates who are targeted as the larger contributors to GHG gases. So this becomes very important to understand how all these corporates are complying with their requirements under corporate law, trade law, and investment law, along with the other compliances, and to understand how their practices are also sustainable. So this becomes very important in regulating the concept of climate law at a large and in a mass mechanism. The fourth element is with respect to climate justice and human rights framework. We are all vulnerable to climate change. We are all going to be victims to climate change and face some kind of damages. But it is an understood fact that there are going to be communities who are at a higher risk, especially the marginalized community like those in the urban slum, below the poverty line, or certain categories of individuals who are at a higher risk. So the idea here is to look at how these resources or the resources available are ready or in a position to cater to these demands and support those at a high risk element. So what the law is also trying to bring in here is to protect the highly vulnerable community against climate change. This could include with the idea of housing rights, maintenance of slum, registration of slums, sanitation, exposure to different diseases as part of these changes, heat waves, floods in case of their movement, how are you ensuring their protection? All of this comes under the ambit of the idea of climate justice. So it becomes important that law takes into consideration these aspects as well. At this point, it's very important to understand that urban planning or those relating to water management becomes very crucial while integrating these practices to ensure that the marginalized community are not put at stake or their practices are not counter impactful on these communities. The fifth element that comes in terms of climate law is the international and regional agreements. Without doubt, the international community has understood the importance of having climate as an element integrated. An action in India could invariably affect how life in Netherlands is going to be. So it is very important that the community at large come down to a consensus. And for this regard, of course, apart from Paris Convention, there has been multiple negotiations and terms brought in as part of international trade, international investments, cross-border relations to understand and integrate the principles of climate law. This is to ensure that countries get into an understanding with each other to ensure that their practices do not contribute to the entire challenge of climate change. Of course, we have seen a change of political scenario where climate by default has taken a second stand. But please remember, it's not about sidelining the concept of climate change, but understanding that the legal practices principle generally adopted has these elements integrated into it. So when you are talking about farmers' rights, or when you're talking about, say, corporate investments, or when you're talking about justice, when you're talking about immigrants, when you're talking about refugees, or whatever be it between the international community, invariably the concept of climate becomes important. It is difficult to have a conversation that does not touch upon these elements. Therefore, the international community has an understanding on this regard. Of course, with the changing political scenarios, this has faced a jerk, but this is not going to go away. This is going to stay. And it is therefore important that as lawyers, as scholars, as activists, we are aware about these principles as existing and look at ways that we can better maximize their utility and implement them greatly. Now that we've looked at the 5 components, you would have figured by now that there is no area in our life that climate doesn't touch. Therefore, the idea of having climate law is to hold each of us responsible, accountable, and also reward for our action. And it's not just about individuals that we are holding accountable. We are bringing in the government, we are bringing in industries, organization, and countries at large to be responsible for their actions so that we have a development that is futuristic, and we also ensure that we do not put anyone at stake for the purpose of growth. So as you saw, climate law is not just about regulating our action against the environment. It's also regulating our action against each other. It's about bringing a social order and a community well-being at large. It's therefore important that law students, lawyers, activists, and anyone who believes in the change and future is aware about these laws and practices and start evaluating the legal regime through the eyes of climate laws. Till we come with more contents on climate law, please ensure that you start working in this regard, start analyzing the legal principles and practices through this lens. Till the next video, please do not forget to like, share and subscribe and ensure this reaches the larger crowd and we're all benefit.